All right, well, welcome everyone. If you want, you can scoot a little closer. So I have two handouts for you. One is going to be just kind of like the outline of what we're going to cover over the next 8 weeks. And then I'm not going to go over this in depth. I'll just kind of highlight a couple of things. So if you want to just take one and pass them around. The second one is the packet for today. So go ahead and take one of each of these packets. So one says Judaism 101, the other one says Introduction to Messianic Judaism. Yes. Yeah, and so right, okay. I did load them into a folder so that they're there. That's right. So if anybody does watch this, if we send this out, there's a folder online that you'll get a link to that has the information to it. So, all right, does everybody have both? You should have one that says Introduction to Messianic Judaism and one that says Judaism 101. All right. So let's open up with a word of prayer. So Avinu Shabashamayim, our Father in heaven, we come back together to study. And we pray, God, that you would open our hearts and our minds to everything that you would have for us, God. And as iron sharpens iron, we would sharpen one another. So we pray all of this in the name of Yeshua. Amen. All right. So one of these is just for your reference, what we're going to be covering each week in this class. This class is really, in many ways, it's intentionally geared to be both an introduction to Judaism and an introduction to Messianic Judaism, because after all, we believe that, Messianic Judaism, the way we view it, is a form of Judaism. All right. So there's an outline here. Actually, I'll just read this top paragraph. It says, whether you are completely uninitiated with Jewish life and culture or just need a refresher, this special series of classes is intended to provide a crash course in Judaism, and more particularly, our unique form of Judaism, Messianic Judaism. Our intention is to help you become better informed and integrated, there's a typo here, into the Simchat Yisrael community and the wider Jewish community. Each class will provide a brief introduction to various aspects of Messianic Jewish life and observance, and is not meant to be an exhaustive study, but rather a springboard for further learning and discussion. All right. So each week is just the beginning of these discussions. So this week we're going to be looking at what is Judaism and the Jewish holidays. So we'll be dealing with questions like, definition of Judaism in a nutshell, who is a Jew, the centrality of the family and the home, the importance of Shabbat and the Jewish holidays. We might not hit all of those in extreme depth. If you go to the second page and third page of your outline, there's some just recommendations on different topics. If you want to read further into some of these things, I just gave you some recommendations. I don't remember if I put some of these have websites, but what I should do is actually give you maybe a digital, because I know that's easier for some people. Anyway, so before we delve into this week, any questions? No? So far? All right. Can I get somebody so now we're going to the one that says Judaism 101, which this is going to be just a quick, in a couple of paragraphs, a quick crash course to a definition of Judaism. So can I get somebody to read nice and loud the first paragraph? Anyone? Okay, thank you.
Judaism is the way of life of the Jewish people, based on principles and ethics embodied in the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, and as further explored and explained in Jewish writings and tradition. Judaism teaches that there is a single God who not only created the universe, but with whom every individual can have a personal relationship. Judaism believes that God is continually at work within the world, affecting every aspect of our lives. The Jewish relationship with God is a unique covenantal relationship whereby God promises to maintain the covenant with the Jewish people in exchange for the Jewish people's continued observance of the mitzvot, commandments, and active involvement in the world.
What we call Kiddush Hashem, which is a sanctification of God's name. So what this is basically saying is like, first and foremost, Judaism is essentially the way of life of the Jewish people. At the same time, there's always been a way going back into biblical times for non-Jews to be brought into that people. This isn't the place to quite unpack that yet, but anyway, who wants to read the next paragraph? Okay, thank you.
Judaism differs from many other faiths in modern times. Central authority is not vested in any single person or group, but in sacred text, traditions, and learned rabbis who interpret and apply texts and traditions to daily life. Throughout the ages, Judaism has clung to a number of religious principles, the most important of which is the belief in a single and unique God who created the universe and continues to govern it. According to traditional Jewish belief, the God who created the world established a covenant with the Israelites and revealed his laws and commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. The traditional practice of Judaism revolves around prayer, study, and the observance of God's commandments as written in the Torah and expounded upon in Jewish tradition.
So this is just kind of a quick, like I said, a super brief crash course in what Judaism is. And just one of the points that I want to emphasize is in the second sentence, it says central authority is not vested in any single group, person group, but rather in texts and traditions. So Judaism doesn't have a pope, right? There's no central authority like the church or Rome or whatever. Even the idea of chief rabbis are not necessarily a rabbi who has a higher authority. Usually the chief rabbi of a city is the designated person who represents the Jewish community to the local government. So often people will look to the chief rabbi as a guide, but the chief rabbi is not like a pope. I mean, like a bishop or something of a town. And we don't have a pope, right? And so even among Orthodox Jews, there's all kinds of arguments of who's in charge, right? Like who are you to tell us the way to do things? Instead, authority is in texts, a body of literature which has the authority, and weight is usually gained by individuals through their knowledge and ability to interpret the text themselves. So authority, rather than being in an office or a location or a central person, is in texts in Judaism. So that's very different than, for example, like the Catholic Church or something where authority, yes, it's supposed to come from the Bible, but is really through a central figure and institution. So we don't have a central figure or central institution in Judaism. Now you might have rabbis who, carry a lot of weight and people look to them, but technically they have no greater, authority than any other rabbi. So when we ask, like, what are the major denominations or movements within Judaism today? The first is Reform Judaism. It is the first in the sense of like the modern, prior to the Enlightenment, which began in like the 1700s. If you're familiar with this term, the Enlightenment was a time of renewal within particularly Europe, but spread to other parts of the world, which is this interest in science, right? And studying the world through more of a scientific method. And as a part of that, it introduced this world called the Enlightenment. In Hebrew, it's called the Haskalah. And the first major group to be influenced by the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment principles were what was called Reform Judaism. And it arose out of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. It started in Germany and sought to reform Judaism to reflect the modern world. It overruled traditional understandings of God, divine authorship of the Bible, and Jewish observance. It declared binding only the ethical but not the ritual commandments of the Torah, Reform Judaism's primary theological center is Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, with additional centers in Jerusalem, New York, and Los Angeles. So as we're going to see in Orthodox Judaism today, no form of Judaism is uninfluenced by the Enlightenment. A lot of times Orthodoxy likes to present itself. Everybody has a myth about themselves that they like to tell, whether it's individuals or even movements and institutions. Orthodoxy likes to present itself as though like it's the unchanged and everybody else is the one that changed. But rather, Orthodoxy today is a response to the Enlightenment and a response to reform. So it also changed because of the Enlightenment, but they don't like to admit that. So Orthodox Judaism is not even a single denomination. Rather, it's a movement of traditionally minded Jews in Germany is where it formed, that originally organized in response to Reform Judaism because they viewed what they were doing was dangerous and it was too much of a break from tradition, and the influence of the Enlightenment and modernity. Orthodox Jews maintain traditional views of God, adherence to the mitzvot, to prayer and Jewish study. There is actually a wide spectrum of Orthodox Jews, ranging from modern Orthodox to Hasidic and other Haredi, what we call Haredi, some people call ultra-Orthodox forms of Judaism. There are also like modern Orthodox and this kind of, so Orthodox doesn't mean a single denomination. It really is kind of an umbrella term. Just like, for example, people might use the term like historic Christianity to refer to the forms of Christianity that see themselves as tied to the historic church. So that would include Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, right? Episcopal, like all the Anglican, right? The historic forms of Christianity. In the same way, Orthodox Judaism just means it's an umbrella term like that encompasses many, many different kinds of Orthodox Judaism. And they don't always agree on everything. Each movement within Orthodoxy has its own center and primary institutions, with the majority being either in Israel or New York. So, for example, the central institution for modern Orthodoxy is Yeshiva University, which is in New York, and it's one of the biggest rabbinical schools for modern Orthodox rabbis. But they're also, like I said, every group has its own institutions. So in response to both of these is conservative Judaism, which is the first of our uniquely American institutions. It arose in the United States in response to reform and grew out of Orthodox Judaism. It sought a way to maintain traditional adherence and understanding, yet still live within a modern framework. The primary theological center for conservative Judaism is the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, with additional centers in Jerusalem and Los Angeles. So I'm not going to test you all, but I want you to know, like, Judaism is like this big thing, and then it has denominations, not as many as Christianity does, but we also have our denominations. So the next one I just want to, and again, this is just a quick crash course through everything. So the next major denomination is Reconstructionist Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism was a breakoff of the conservative movement. It was founded by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan in the 40s. It sought to reimagine Judaism not as a religion, but as a civilization. Therefore, observance of Judaism is understood to be a response to social and cultural continuity rather than divine decree. What that means is basically the reason why we do these things is not because any higher being told us to do it. We do it because it's just what keeps the Jews together as a civilization, right? And so and the main theological center for Reconstructionist Judaism is in Philadelphia, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. So Reconstructionism is, of all the denominations, the only one that tries to define itself not as a denomination, but rather as a movement. But as I mentioned, it seeks to redefine Judaism as a civilization, not as a religion. So it actually encourages observance, but again, not because God told us to do these things, but it's what keeps Jews together as Jews. So another major, but it's a much smaller movement, is called Jewish Renewal. It's a sort of New Age, neo-Hasidic, mystical, and spiritual movement. It's like Jewish hippie movement. One of its primary founders was Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was originally a Chabad rabbi. If you don't know what Chabad is, that's okay. Again, you're not being tested on this. And there's just only so much I can explain. So originally, he was a Chabad rabbi along with Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. As a Holocaust survivor, Reb Zalman constantly sought to re-energize Jewish life and make it more meaningful to Jewish people after the destruction of European Jewry. His priority was to develop a Jewish expression focused more on experience than doctrine. The Jewish Renewal Movement's main theological center is Aleph, which is also in Philadelphia. There's not a denomination, but a really growing movement of congregations that could fall under the umbrella that we label independent minyan movement. So they're not a part of any denomination, but they're defining features of these congregations. So the independent minyan movement is an innovative and decentralized movement inspired primarily by younger adults with very strong formative Jewish experiences, meaning they went to Hebrew school, summer camps, and active Jewish participation. The movement tends to be lay-led, traditional in observance, yet socially aware and politically progressive. Many are connected through Hadar in New York City. Hadar is becoming almost a theological center for this movement, even though it started very decentralized. So Hadar is an organization, but it also has a congregation, has a yeshiva and different things. So it's leans observance-wise very traditional, but it's very socially progressive. So it's like an interesting mix where usually observance tends to put you more conservative. They lean much more progressive, but in observance, they're much more traditional than like your average conservative synagogue, for example. Another denomination that I put here is Messianic Judaism. And this definition comes from the UMJC, which our congregation is a part of. So the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations envisions Messianic Judaism as a movement of Jewish congregations and groups committed to Yeshua the Messiah that embrace the covenantal responsibility of Jewish life and identity rooted in Torah, expressed in tradition, and renewed and applied in the context of the new covenant. Now, I'm not going to unpack this because we're going to get all into Messianic Judaism later. I'm just giving you the way we understand Messianic Judaism is within this broader picture of Judaism as a whole, right?
Somebody missing.
What's that?
Crime. Crime.
Crime?
Crime.
The Karaites?
Yeah.
There's only a handful of real Karaites. So they have no influence on the Jewish world. So yes, there are. Yeah, but I don't list every tiny little. I just have the main denominations here. So he's referring to, there's a group of people from the Middle Ages called the Karaites, and the Karaites they're completely insignificant, have no influence on Jewish life. But they're people, at one time they did though. In the Middle Ages, they were a pretty influential movement especially in the Middle East. And they were a movement of Jews who rejected rabbinic tradition and went only by the Tanakh. The problem is, as we'll discuss more in this class, it's actually impossible to directly observe the Bible without some sense of tradition. So they basically developed a whole entire tradition. They have their own way of tying tzitzit, their own way of observing Shabbat. So they're full of tradition, even though they rejected rabbinic tradition. But the Karaites, there's some in Israel and some pockets still in like in Egypt and in like Iraq, Iran area. There's a lot of Messianics who claim to be Karaites, but they're not real Karaites. They're just, anyway, but there are real Karaites. They have no influence. Nobody takes them seriously. All right. Karaites, Karaites. And at one time in the Middle Ages, they were a large movement. But it's hard to pass down something that isn't as concretized. No, the scenes are totally different. We're talking about, it's really comparing like apples to oranges, because the world of the Second Temple is like very different than what they're responding to. But the reason why they had a lot of influence in the Middle Ages was they were the ones, because of their only adhere to the Bible rather than, the rabbinic literature of like the Talmud and everything. So they became the keepers of textual tradition of the scribal tradition. And so they were the ones who developed the initial like glossaries and concordances, and were very, careful in the Masoretic tradition of like, those who are the scribal people who passed down the Bible and teaching, the biblical text and stuff. And so there's, in fact, one of the oldest copies of the Bible that we have, the Aleppo Codex, I think it's the Aleppo Codex, is a Karaite scribe who did it. So some of the works that we have that are still preserved, it's because they were preserved through the Karaite community. But like I said, there's only a handful, it's hard to know exactly.
Valuable and not proper.
Listen, I could name plenty of other people, various Hasidic, actually there are various Hasidic movements that have far more influence, far more influence than the Karaites. Chabad, for example, is one type of Orthodox community that everybody knows Chabad, and they actually do influence the Jewish community. The Karaites haven't influenced people for hundreds of years. So, and like I said, there may be a couple hundred at best, maybe I don't know, maybe 1,000, I don't know. So I just put these are the major denominations, especially if you're an American, that you're going to encounter. So, but when we talk about Judaism, you can't talk about Judaism without defining the question of who is a Jew, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to touch on this, and we can't spend a ton of time, but it is impossible to discuss Judaism without talking about the Jewish people. After all, Judaism in its essence is the way of life of the Jewish people, who are the direct descendants of the ancient Israelites of the Bible. As Nicholas Delange notes, the Jewish people are a scattered people living in many different countries and belong to many different ethnic and linguistic groupings and many different cultural backgrounds. Even within a single country, these differences divide Jewish communities one from another. This makes it difficult. I don't think, did I include? Yeah, I do have a quote here you'll see from Chaim Halevi Donin. The Jews don't fit in your usual categories of, for example, race or even just a single ethnicity, because the problem is because of Jews have been scattered for the last couple thousand years, 2,000 to 3,000 years, Jews have reflected all of the countries in which we've been scattered. Right. And we don't fit into a single race. If you go to Israel, like there are Black Jews and Asian Jews, and you know what I mean? Like there's white Jews, like, like me and many in the United States come from mostly Ashkenazi Jews. But those Ashkenazi Jews are by far not the majority of the Jewish people. Right. So major ethnic and cultural geographic groupings of Jewish people. Now, obviously, I'm missing people, and there's going to be people like the Karaites and stuff that are not mentioned here, but these are the major groupings of people. The first is Ashkenazi. Ashkenaz is the term used in the Bible for like the areas of like Germany and those countries. So Jews who are more recently in their ancestry from Europe are called Ashkenazi Jews, and they have their own unique customs, prayer traditions, stuff like that. Next is another term most of you have probably heard called Sephardic. It's from the Hebrew word Sfarad, which is Spain. And these are Jews from Spain and those communities established following the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. We don't have time to go into this, but you've probably, might or might not be aware that Jews were expelled from the entire Iberian Peninsula and parts of Italy in 1492 and in the first few years following that. And so they reestablished themselves, mostly spread out around the Mediterranean. And in many cases, they're competing with the existing Mizrahi Jews. And so in places like Morocco, you have the Sephardic Jews, and then you have Mizrahi Jews who have different customs and different practices. And, over time, they'll intermarry. But even up until recently, they read Torah differently. Some of their nusach, meaning like the order of prayers and stuff, is different. And by the way, each of these groups have their own prayer books. So like there's an Ashkenazi prayer book, and even within that, there's some variations in tradition. There's a Sephardic prayer book. Mizrahi is another term. Mizrach is the Hebrew word for east. These are Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, often lumped with Sephardim, but they're actually really different practice because their practice doesn't come from Spain. It comes from in many cases, what's indigenous to what's called the Eretz Israel practice, the practice of Jews from Israel. And then there are Ethiopian Jews. This is a significant community that, that for centuries lived in Ethiopia. With the establishment of the modern state of Israel, there's now tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews in Israel who are airlifted there. There's still many Ethiopian Jews left in Ethiopia, but most of the primary community was brought, I think, in the 70s and 80s to Israel. But one thing that's unique about the Ethiopian Jews is they were kind of disconnected from the rest of the Jewish community. They're not like these scattered, like lost tribes. Everybody knew about them, but at the same time, for a long time, they didn't have the same interaction with the rest of the Jewish community. So they never had the Talmud. Like a lot of their practice was pre-rabbinic. So they're still recognized as Jews because they never lost their Jewish identity. That's why they're still treated as Jews. They didn't have the same practices as many Jews up until recently. There's another, major category of Jews called the B'nai Menashe, which are Jews in India. They call themselves B'nai Menashe, which means children of Manasseh. But anyway, they're also not like a lost tribe. They're a group who they're readily identified as Jews. And there are other like scattered groups, but these are the main groupings. By the way, all these people speak their own languages. For most of modern history, post-destruction of the temple, for the majority of history it wasn't until the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, that the majority of Jews lived under Christianity. Prior to that, the majority of Jews lived under Islam. And so for most of recent Jewish history, Jews spoke Arabic. So there's a wealth of literature in what we call Judeo-Arabic. So kind of the languages, major Jewish language groups. Obviously, everybody knows Hebrew. Nobody questions that Hebrew is a Jewish language, right? But there's also Yiddish, which is spoken by European Jews, which is a mixture of German and other Slavic languages. And it's a little different. Yeah. Yeah. And then there's Ladino. Ladino is a Spanish-based language that was spoken by Jews in Spain and then spread out. As Jews were spread out, then it spread around the biggest, by the way, the biggest community of Ladino speakers today are in Turkey. Yeah. So.
Who founded this country.
Uh-huh.
Part or two who could speak Ladino.
Oh, that's amazing. Huh. That's pretty cool. There's some great. From Turkey. Huh. Yeah. One time there was a big Jewish community in Istanbul and the surrounding areas. So another is, I mentioned Judeo-Arabic. So if you've ever heard of a term like from the Cairo Geniza or other things, most of those documents are in Judeo-Arabic, which is written with Hebrew letters, but the language itself is Arabic. Yeah. And it has a lot of Hebrew mixed into it. There's also Judeo-Greek, believe it or not. Greek was far more common than people realized during the New Testament and the next few hundred years. Really, it's not until the conquest, like the development of Islam and the conquest of Islam in the Middle East, that Greek is pushed aside as a Jewish language. And there's a lot of discussion in rabbinic texts about the use of Greek. So for example, the rabbis say you can say the Shema in Greek. And, so Greek had a lot more influence than people realize. As of 2023, last year, the world Jewish population was estimated at 16.1 million people. And that's 0.2% of the world population. And it's over 2% of the US population. 47% of Jewish people live in Israel and 53% live in the diaspora. So we're almost getting to a time in history where, almost half of the entire Jewish population lives in Israel. Only in the last couple of years did the population of Israel surpass the population of the United States, Jewish-wise, not all of the United States, but there are about 6 million Jews in the United States. There's now over 7 million Jews in Israel. So there are now more Jews in Israel than any other country in the world. But it took a long time for that to happen. And by the way, this is only about what the Jewish community was before the Holocaust. So we haven't even quite recovered yet. To lose 6 million people of a small, so we're still trying to recover from all the Jews that were killed during the Holocaust. It's 1/3 of world Jewry was killed during the Holocaust. So we're not even quite where we were beforehand. So question. Yeah. So the number of about 6 million includes converts to Judaism. As of 2020, I already read that part. So any questions so far about like Judaism itself, denominations, or different, kind of groupings of Jewish people? Like the major kind of cultural groupings? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. So, right. So technically, Semitic people groups and Semitic languages, at least biblically speaking, are traced through their descendants of Shem. So, for example, the term anti-Semitism technically can refer to like just hatred of anybody who's a Semitic people group. However, the definition over time has evolved to mean specifically hatred of Jews. Like Jew hatred is what anti-Semitism is. But the Semitic language family or Semitic people groups is definitely broader than just like anti-Semitism means hatred of Jews, because you also have like Islamophobia and like other terms we use for other types of Semitic, hatred of Semitic peoples. But when you're talking about the language or people groups, Semitic is the correct term more broadly. Because, for example, Semitic is a language family, and Hebrew is a Semitic language, but there are others too, like Arabic, Amharic, Aramaic, right? So there's a number of Semitic languages and Semitic people groups. So all the Canaanites, most of them were Semitic peoples.
Would that even include Rabbi?
I don't know if Urdu is
Just curious.
no, it's a good question. It's just it's a good question. I don't know if anybody Urdu, if it's a Semitic language. It's like spoken by yeah. But I don't know. I think it could be Indo-European, but I'm not yeah. No. It could be Indo-European, or it could be.
Because
Is it from Sanskrit?
no,
Then it's not.
actually it's a derivation of Arabic, the letters.
Oh, is it? I mean, maybe, I don't know.
Sanskrit's totally different.
Right. I don't know. Yeah. I just don't know, but there are.
My
Oh.
last name's Wasim.
Okay. Well, which is great. I don't think the Armenian language is Semitic. I think it's Indo-European or Slavic. No, it's not Slavic, is it?
Armenians come from Shem.
Maybe there's a history of the people, but the language is not Semitic. I don't know. All right, just because we have a lot to cover, let me just keep blasting through here, and then I'll open it up to questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of this. I'm not going to go through like the Jewish holidays one by one, but all right. So challenges of defining Jewish identity. So even though like we want to define Jewish identity, it's also difficult to do. Issues of Jewish identity and determining who is a Jew can be complicated, as the Jewish people do not fit neatly into common categories of race, religion, or ethnicity. According to Chaim Halevi Donin, who was I think he recently passed away, but he was part of the leadership at Yeshiva University. He's an Orthodox Jewish academic. This is his category. Somebody want to read this so you don't have to listen to me? Anybody? Fabian?
Basics of their origin. Jews everywhere have regarded themselves as a member of the family. Yet, despite the diversity that exists among them and the multitude of languages they speak, Jews regard themselves as related as true brethren stemming from a common Semitic family. Jews have never quite been able to fit into the convenient categories used by historians or sociologists to define nations, races, religions, and other historic groups. The Jews are not just a religious faith, even though they are that. They are not just a nation, even though they are that too, according to the definitions of the term nation. The problem is usually resolved by using the term people instead of either faith or nation. This difficulty is categorizing the Jewish people. May well be part of their uniqueness.
Yeah, you don't have to. Yeah, that's just saying that the italices inside this quote are his, not mine. So Donen just kind of highlights the challenge. At the same time, you know, when you do genetic testing, like it's clear that all Jews are related, but then you also mix in those who are converts to Judaism, like, you know what I mean? So that's why Judaism is not strictly a race. And it's also one of the reasons why, according to Jewish law, things like a DNA test don't count, right? For determining who is a Jew according to Jewish law. Because Jewish law defines who is a Jew, not, you know, like a test, right? Or DNA, because what about a convert to Judaism? Like somebody who is a convert to Judaism is treated as though they are native born, right? So anyway, so the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, of which up until just recently, Rabbi Tony was the executive director and is still, you know, a big part of the MJRC. Like I'm part of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. So is Tom, and so is Josh Guzman. So according to the definition of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, following the consensus of Jewish tradition, we recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish mother or who is a convert to Judaism. We also recognize as a Jew anyone who is born of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother if that person has undertaken public and formal acts of identification with the Jewish faith and people. According to the UMJC, Jewish identity is best understood as neither a strictly religious category nor a strictly ethnic category, but as membership of a people. The primary criterion for defining Jewish identity is Jewish birth. Traditional Judaism recognizes one born of a Jewish mother as Jewish, based on biblical precedent and reflecting the practice of some elements of the wider Jewish community. We would also consider one born of a Jewish father and a Gentile mother to be Jewish if he or she identifies as a Jew. Since Jewish identity is not strictly ethnic, however, the discovery of Jewish ancestry beyond one's grandparents does not in and itself render one Jewish. I know that this is challenging in our modern world, which basically says if I identify as any particular thing, then I'm that. Instead, you need to understand that Jews think tribally. Like, it's not up to you to define who you are. It's up to the community to define who you are. And this thinking, by the way, is the way that the law works towards Native Americans. So as you might be well aware, is that if you are a member of a Native American tribe that is recognized by the United States, that there's certain benefits that you know, that have been agreed upon that you are entitled to. That doesn't mean that you can take a DNA test and then say, look, I'm Native American. Like, that's great, but it doesn't change the law. Only the tribe defines who is a member of the tribe. So if you are not recognized by a tribe, then you are not Native American according to the purposes of the law. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Jewish law is the same way. It doesn't matter whether you took a DNA test. Like, if you have been broken off for hundreds of years from the Jewish community, you're not Jewish, right? But there is a way recognizing for those who were legitimate, like, for example, descendants of conversos, those who were like forced to convert to, you know, in Spain or Portugal or elsewhere, Judaism does recognize like these are people who at one time might have had legitimate Jewish descent and is embracing of a way to bring them back. But in and of itself, that doesn't make them Jewish. If the link between you and the Jewish people has been broken for generations, especially beyond one's grandparents, then in order, you can rejoin the Jewish people, but there's an official process for doing that. Does that make sense? I don't want to go into this too much depth. I just want to first like unpack these because we can't discuss anything else in this class without dealing with this stuff. Okay, so we're almost done. And then we'll open it to some discussion and questions. So here's a note on this idea of rediscovering Jewish identity. As noted above, since Jewish identity is not strictly ethnic, the discovery of Jewish ancestry beyond one's grandparents does not in itself render one Jewish. Halachically, so the word halacha, which we're going to talk more about in coming weeks, just in Hebrew, the word holech means to walk. So if I say ani holech le supermarket, like I'm walking to the supermarket, it just means the way of living Jewishly, right? Usually we define halakha as Jewish law, but really it's the way to be Jewish, right? So halachically, to be considered Jewish, one needs to be a part of the ongoing chain of continuous Jewish life or complete a formal conversion process. Therefore, a person of distant Jewish descent beyond one's grandparents or who recently discovered possible Jewish ancestry or took a DNA test should speak to a rabbi, as they may need to go through a public and formal act of identification to be formally considered Jewish. This also includes descendants of conversos whose families were forced to convert to Christianity in Spain or elsewhere in Europe in past centuries. If you have any questions about Jewish identity, speak to Rabbi Tony or myself. We want to be embracing of people, but it's also important as a Jewish community that we establish some boundaries. At the same time, one of the things that makes Messianic synagogues unique is that we openly welcome and embrace Gentiles to be a part of our community. Now, by the way, anyone is welcome in any synagogue, but because most synagogues are trying to also keep the boundaries of Jewish identity, your participation might not be the same as it would be here. But don't think that, just because we're unique in the sense of we're very welcoming and embracing, that somehow means that, non-Jews are not welcome in synagogues. You're welcome to visit, but you would be limited on membership and that kind of stuff. You couldn't be a member. We're here because we believe we also have this Messianic mandate to include those from the nations. It's also, this is one of the challenges, and I know Rabbi Tony could, speak just as much on this topic of one of the unique challenges of a Messianic synagogue is we're trying to balance the universality of the gospel with the particularity of the Jewish people, right? And so you wrote that? Well, thank you for writing that, because it's an important point that it's I don't know if you want to say anything or add to that.
Yeah, you wrote an article in Kesher.
Oh, that's right. That might even be where I got that from.
Well, I don't think I have much to add to it. It's just the idea that there is a universal nature to life in Messiah Yeshua.
Right.
And that walls have been broken down. All you have to do is look at Ephesians chapter 2, the enmity has been broken down. So we have to embrace that principle, but at the same time, the uniqueness of the Jewish people is an essential part of the gospel. as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so the thing is, and I think we need to get back to thinking in the biblical sense or the Jewish sense, and up until more recently could be true. It's now we're getting more and more bifurcated. But the idea that you can have two truths that are self-evident, right? And both of these are true. The universality of the gospel and the particularity of the God's covenant with the Jewish people, they're both true. They're both equally true. It's just a Messianic synagogue now has to somehow figure out how to bring these two things together. And it's not always easy. And Rabbi Tony will tell you, we don't have all the answers, but this is what we're trying to do. So let me just say a little bit on this, and then we're going to talk about this more in week 5. Okay. So even if we didn't answer all your questions, I don't know if we still will in week 5, but we're going to talk more about this in week 5. So, but I do want to say that we greatly value the participation of all our members, Jews and Gentiles. As a Messianic synagogue, we welcome and include those from non-Jewish backgrounds who are called to support and participate in the life and destiny of the Jewish people. Obviously, if you don't support the call and destiny of the Jewish people, we might not be the best congregation. We love you and everything, but you might get more frustrated. We might get frustrated with each other over time. At the same time, Gentiles are guests in Jewish space. So we welcome everyone except, at the same time, Gentiles are guests in Jewish space. It is important to note the practice of Judaism does not necessarily equal being Jewish, and Gentiles who participate in Messianic Judaism, that a Gentile who does participate in Messianic Judaism is a Messianic Gentile, not a Messianic Jew. Similar to the role of God-fearers in the New Testament, which we'll talk more about in the future. Therefore, our goal of inclusiveness must also be balanced with the Bible's teachings on Israel's unique calling and covenant, as well as Jewish tradition and halakha. So again, this is what we're trying to figure out. And if you're willing to walk with us, through this little bit of a messy thing that we're trying to do, we welcome you if you resonate with this. So any questions, on this before we just hit some of the major Jewish holidays? And I'm not going to go read through every single one on this list, but we'll talk about the Jewish holidays in a second. So anything on Judaism or the Jewish people or denominations within Judaism, any of the stuff we talked about so far? For some of you, this might be controversial. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Like I said, we'll talk more about some of this stuff. Anything? I don't want to rush people. All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So one of the things we will just kind of mention is when we talk about Judaism and Jewish spirituality, it's bigger than just the biblical text or the people, even though all of this is interconnected. It's that spider web, right? The God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel are all deeply interconnected. But there's also this idea of the rhythms of Jewish time, that through the cycle of the year, we have these rhythms as we go through the year. And as we go through life, there are life cycles, these rhythms of life. And we'll talk more about the life cycles next week, I think it is. But on this is just a brief, quick, couple of sentences on each of the major Jewish holidays. So you see Shabbat is usually always listed first because it appears every week, and is considered special on the Jewish calendar. And then it goes through, beginning with the fall festivals through all the way to Tisha B'Av. You can read more about these on your own, and you can review, this packet, or if you have questions. I know there was one question that Phoebe asked me, so I'll refer to it since Phoebe noticed it, is if you look on here, it mentions Purim, which is the next holiday that's coming up, right? Purim commemorates the annulment of the decree against the Jewish people in ancient Persia, somewhere, if you want to try to date it, around the late 6th century BCE, as recorded in the biblical book of Esther. Now, on the Jewish calendar, yesterday was what's called Purim Katan, Little Purim. But if you noticed on the announcements, we're not celebrating Purim till next week. I mean, not next week. I don't want to scare anybody. It's not next week already. In next month. So Phoebe had this great question of why is there 2 Purims on the calendar this year? Does anybody know other than Rabbi Tony?
2 others? 2 months of others.
Yes. And what were you going to say?
Okay.
What were you going to say? Yes. So you're both right. So okay. So Rabbi Tony already explained it. Oh,
He gets explained it on his house.
okay. So the Jewish calendar is actually really complicated mathematically, because it's not always consistent. But right. So the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, not solar, which is, so when we think of a 365-day year, it's based on a solar calendar. So going all the way back to Genesis, Jews have relied on a lunar calendar, right? Because it was evening and then morning day 1, then evening and morning day 2, evening then morning day 3, evening then morning day, right? So the idea of Eves or Erev is from this biblical concept that the day actually begins at nightfall the night before. So the challenge is a lunar and a solar calendar don't line up. And so in order to make the correction so that the lunar calendar and the solar calendar line up, we have leap years. And this happens to be a leap year. And also, even in a solar calendar, like, is this year, I think even on, yeah, because I think we're going to have 29 days this year in February.
Next week.
Right. So, yeah. So anyway, so this is a leap year that we have to do even within our solar calendar to line up with the sun. And the lunar calendar has to do the same thing. So this happens to be a leap year on the Jewish calendar, but we don't just add a day, we actually add a whole month. So going back to what, yes, so that's what Yaakov was mentioning, is that there are 2 Adars this year. Normally there's 1 Adar. But this year we have Adar 1 and Adar 2. We add a whole leap month in there. So why that is relevant once we get through lunar, solar, 2 months, leap year, is that normally Purim would fall in a single month of Adar. But because we have 2 months, the celebration of Adar of Purim is moved to the 2nd Adar, but we mark on the calendar when it would normally be. So to answer your question,
Okay.
Purim Katan, the little Purim, is kind of notes this is when we should normally observe Purim, but we're not until 2nd Adar. And so it is on the calendar. And some people have a custom of maybe, I don't know, like doing something related to Purim on Purim Katan, but it's not the official observance of Purim, which doesn't happen until the 2nd Adar. And Adar is the name of, there are different names of the months. And yeah, so Adar is one of the names of the month. So in 2nd Adar, then we have, that's when we're going to celebrate Purim. So that's to answer your question. So
Yeah, the calendar stuff sometimes just gets to me because there's so.
yeah. Well, and the Jewish calendar is really complicated to figure out. Well, it's not consistent. It's not like every 3 years or whatever. It's because it's based on complicated calculations. And by the way, there was even a calendar discrepancy between Babylon and Israel on this, like in the early rabbinic period. But as we go through these, the rhythms of the Jewish calendar, the next, major holiday we're going to observe is Purim. And I know you asked me about that, and I told you to remind me if I didn't address it. So any other questions on like I said, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through each holiday, but if there is one that you want me to, if you have a question about, or just on the Jewish calendar in general, what I should have done is actually maybe give you the actual Jewish calendar. Maybe I should add that next time. Yes.
2023 is corresponding to
5784. Right. So on the Christian calendar,
In 5784 for real.
so wait. Let me clarify this. So because both of them are based off of human calculations, right?
Yeah.
So the Gregorian calendar that we use, basically your basic secular calendar, is actually a Christian calendar that was developed by a Christian monk in the Middle Ages, in an attempt to determine the year that Yeshua was born, right? Which is year 0. So everything after that is Anno Domini, right? In the year of our Lord. Everything before that is BC, before Christ. So the challenge is Yeshua was actually born, now that, since the Middle Ages, we've gotten a little better at our math. Not just the math. It wasn't like he was a bad math guy, but, a lot of these things, even related to the Jewish calendar, which I'll mention in a second, are based off of people's attempt to try to get back to either the dating of Yeshua or creation. And their attempts at trying to count generations. The problem is we don't exactly know how many years is a generation. On average, people usually say 40. But is it shorter? Is it long? Right. There are also generations that are not mentioned, right? We don't know exactly. So, but according to Jewish tradition, it's been 5,784 years since creation. So on the Jewish calendar, the reason because we don't count it by when Jesus was born, we count it by from when creation of the world. So according to Jewish tradition, like I said, tradition, the calendar is 5,084. It's been 5,784 years since creation. So that's the difference between the numbering. So, because like even on the Christian calendar, you have it's 2023 BC. I mean AD, but there's actually time before year zero, right? Which we call BC. So then you have to go back further. So time is not only 2024 years old, it's older than that, but that's since we begin at zero. Whereas the Jewish calendar, our zero is creation rather than the birth of Jesus.
You don't know.
Um,
Nobody.
the Yeshua though was born. Wait, hold on a second. Yeshua though was born, now that we have a little better understanding, was like 3 to 5 BC. So he was actually born before year zero. But it's still approximately, 2,000 years ago. Hey, that monk actually got within just a few years. So I say kudos.
Good job.
L'chaim to the monk, whatever his name is. I don't remember his name. Maybe Rabbi Tony remembers his name. Yeah, I don't know. But thanks to him, we know like approximately when Yeshua was born.
Give or take.
He was only off by at most 8 years.
He died.
He was off only at most 8 years. That's not bad when you figure like he's just simply working off the Bible and some other texts and stuff.
Like the calendars and some of it's like, okay.
Right.
Gives me a headache after a while.
Right. So, I mean, I could have easily gone through and spent a lot more time dissecting this, but hopefully you'll read through this week. If you have questions, you can always email me or like we'll discuss them more. I think as we get through this class, you're going to have more and more questions and we'll spend more time in discussion. Sorry, go ahead.
Because my birthday was on the Shabbat.
Yeah, Tu B'Shvat.
Yeah. I'm like, what is it?
Yeah, Tu
It's a
B'Shvat.
new year for trees. Okay. Yay.
Yeah, so the Mishnah in a tractate called Rosh Hashanah, which deals with laws related to the new year and Rosh Hashanah. So it mentions that the Bible has different reckoning. Like how you determine the year of trees is different than you do for people, or the reigns of kings is determined differently than, for example, and this stuff matters because, for example, if you're supposed to bring a like a calf in its first year as an offering, you have to know. Well, you have to not only know when it's born, it's like, how do you know whether it's reached the first year or not? Is it a year and a half or is it only 6 months? Right? Because if I just say, it was born sometime in 2023, it's not going to cut it. You have to know. So the Mishnah tells us that there are different New Years for different things. So Rosh Hashanah that we call Rosh Hashanah is the new year for years, but the reigns of kings and other things are different. And so, but according to the biblical calendar, does anybody know when the first month is? It's not Tishrei. It's Nisan or Aviv. It's called two things in the Bible. Its oldest name is Aviv. Nisan is the spring, but Aviv is the anyway, no, you're right. Nisan, Aviv is the same month. Yes.
Babylon.
Yeah, from Babylonians, but its older name is Aviv, but they're the same, they're referring to the same month. That's according to the Bible, the first month, right.
Yeah.
But we celebrate the new year of the years, which is like the civil new year. Right. Think about it, how like we still function with different calendars. For example, many institutions have like a fiscal calendar, which is different than the annual, so like when you think about it, it's not so crazy that we actually do function with different calendars, right? The school year calendar is different than the, right? So, all right. So any other questions about holiday Phoebian?
Right. I don't understand and like an explanation. Why do we say, can you hear that song when you're reciting at the end of service? Why do we? I started hearing that.
Can you hear that song?
That song. Why do we say that?
I never heard that.
You say it because I hear it mostly from
something that you guys say up there. You read something and
can you hear that song? And then
No,
I don't
it's
understand.
very
Why do
well.
we say that?
Well,
Not so.
understand the question.
Oh.
Hear our song.
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear that song? Okay.
Not alone now, we have to go.
No. It's a great question. This is a great question. This is a great question because when you're using multiple languages in your service, things can sound like something else, right?
And that's one of those times.
And this is one of those times.
But I hear what you're saying, because I hear it too.
Yes. We're not saying, can you hear that song?
It's really bad. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna write it in Hebrew, and then I'll write it in transliteration.
Oh, sure.
No, it's okay.
So.
Okay.
Enunciate clearly, too.
No, I'm guilty. That's so.
You too.
So can you hear ratzon?
That song.
So instead of saying
hear
can you hear ratzon? I love this actually because I never thought about it and think for that song. So can you hear ratzon means yes, right? What does can in Hebrew mean? Yes.
Yes.
Like basically, may it
It be so.
be your will.
Your will. Okay.
Ratzon, will.
Ratzon is will. Yehi is to
Desire.
be. Yehi is to be.
I'm
So,
gonna get over this
so
very
we usually
soon.
translate this as may it be your will, or like yes, according to your will, something like that. So what we're saying is during the Aaronic benediction,
Yeah.
when you get to the major parts of the blessing,
Yeah.
we say, not can you hear the song? We're saying, Cain yehi ratzon, yes, according to your will, like may it be your will. And then, so Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Cain yehi ratzon, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'funeh, Cain yehi ratzon. Yeah, so it's not, can you hear the song? It's, may it be your will.
This was the best part.
That's great. I'm so glad you asked. And anybody else who wondered why we keep saying, "Did anybody hear that?" Now you know. We were talking about this up here. If you can't see it, anyway, there's nobody there, but just for posterity reasons. That's a great question. It's a great question. So yeah, otherwise I couldn't understand what your question. Any other questions?
You can't add to this.
Now I gave you guys, I'm telling you, I gave you a lot of information, more than you even probably realize I did. But like I said, this is going to be sort of a crash course through this. And so, again, you can review this. If you have any questions, just let me know. My email's on, I should have put it on both of them, but it's on the outline. Yeah, or you can call the synagogue. There's ways of finding me. Any other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh.
What is something called the purpose and of the Jewish people? What is the purpose of Jewish people?
It's a good question. So normally we see our responsibility as the Jewish people's responsibility is what we call Kiddush Hashem. This is what it says in Ezekiel, which is the sanctification of God's name. Like that by God's associated his name with the people, right? Called the people of Israel, like the God of Israel. God's name has kind of been applied to the people. And so our job, we don't always do it well, but our job is supposed to be to reflect God in the world, not as better or worse than anybody else, but is just simply a reflection of what God wants to do in the world. And so that's the role of the Jewish people. And the way we do that is covenantal, right? That God made a covenant with us and the expectation that we would follow in the ways of God. But Israel was then to be a light to the nations, to then take that message to everybody else. Like the role of Israel was not to hoard the message, but to be a light to the nations, to then, not to make everybody like Israel. Like one of the unique, apart from Messianic Jews who we do want people to believe in Yeshua, Judaism itself is not a proselytizing religion, meaning that we don't think our way is the only way. And so therefore, in order for people to be right with God, they have to convert to Judaism. Judaism has conversion, but it's not for the same purposes of you don't go to hell if you don't convert to Judaism kind of idea, right? It's rather of those people like Ruth. If you're familiar with the story of Ruth in the Bible, like her and her sister married Israelites. By the way, and I mentioned this last week, if you were in last week's class, is the term Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish are often used interchangeably, but they also refer to distinct periods in the evolution of the people, right? Because like even Hebrews, for example, Ishmael and Isaac are Hebrews, right? And then same with Isaac and Esau. Wait, didn't I just say them? Jacob. I'm sorry. So,
Abraham.
right. So Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, but Jews and Israelites are only those who are descendants of Judah. Right. I'm sorry, of Jacob. The 12 tribes of Jacob are the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's a myth, and I talked about this last week, and maybe we'll talk about it more in the future. There's a myth on the internet that Jews are only the descendants of Judah, and that's not true. So
Not today days, and not because you can determine today who is the
right. We don't.
Jew or tribe of the Manasseh.
Right.
Or
Most
tribe of the-
Most Jews today don't know what the tribe they were from, just because over the
region.
years there's been so much intermarriage. There are people who do, but usually those who are like either there has to be a reason, like you're either a Cohen, like you're from the priestly line, or Levites. Right? So because there's still roles in the Jewish community for those people. Otherwise, unless you came from some kind of a significant family where that was passed down, like most Jews don't know what tribe they're from. But my point is going back even to the time of the New Testament. Look at James, to the 12 tribes that are in the diaspora. Like they knew that there are other Jews out there. They knew who, even the ones that went into exile, this idea of like the 10 lost tribes, they were never lost. Right? They knew exactly where they were, even if they weren't in Israel anymore. Anyway, so the area during the time of David and the time of the New Testament, Israel was called Judea. And so the people were identified as residents of Judea, not necessarily only from Judah. Because, like, for example, even Paul, refers to himself as a Jew, but he's a Benjamite. Like, he's not only from Judah, right? And I could go into more of this, but we don't have time. So, anyway, any other questions? Oh, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Nestor,
Is that-
sorry.
is crash course,
Yeah. So what I was saying though, and like the point that I was making is like Judaism, there have been some crazy stories of forced conversions in the past. This happened under the time of the descendants of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. There was forced conversions, but that was very rare. That's like one of the only times in history that ever happened. We do have some stories of kingdoms that converted to Judaism, but that wasn't under by force, it was by choice. So for example, in a modern example of this is the Abu Udaya. So in Uganda, there's a whole huge tribe that converted to Judaism over 100 years ago. But going back even centuries back, there was a kingdom in, I think near the Black Sea. I forget what it's called now, but like a whole kingdom that converted to Judaism and stuff, not the weird anti-Semitic one, or the story that people think that Ashkenazi Jews are descendants of Khazars or whatever. No, it's a legitimate. Starts with an A. Anyway. But there were people groups that did convert to Judaism, and most of them just either it faded out or they were absorbed into the wider Jewish community. So, by the way, for a time, a good significant portion of Yemen was Jewish. Yeah, even Yemen. That's where there were a lot of Jews in Yemen up until the establishment of the state of Israel. So, all right. Any other questions before we wrap up? No? Well,
Who was Khazars?
who?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because I heard three different kinds of versions.
Right.
The
Well, that's what I
Jews
mean.
come
There's like,
from the run away from the, and part of them was Christians who was run away from Judea after the whatever it's happened there when they was slaughtered and spread over,
I don't know.
and they settle on east part of the Caspian, between Caspian and Black Sea, and also in
Yeah.
Crimea.
Yeah.
some
I
say.
mean, it could be. I mean, obviously Jews were trying to
And
escape.
They call them Khazars because they create like own government and ruled by the Torah.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
they following the Torah.
Yeah, I don't.
Or-
There are different versions of the story. I just don't
And
know
keep the
that much
Hebrew
about it. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. But a lot of people try to make this, like especially anti-Semites, this argument that Ashkenazi Jews are not real Jews, that we're descended of some like, I don't know, group that converted to Judaism. And I'm not up on the most, but anyway, I just know like it's not true because genetic like DNA studies that have been done on Ashkenazi Jews, like there was a lot of intermarriage. But it was conversion. Like, often in these early centuries when Jews followed, by the way, Jewish settlement followed the Roman, like the travel of the Roman soldiers. So for example, the Danube, which served as the more northernmost border for the Roman Empire, in Budapest, there's also a Roman settlement there. And there are gravestones, Jewish gravestones that are there, which means Jews were settled there following the Romans before the Hungarian tribes ever got to Hungary. But Jews were following these trade routes. They needed to make money, and so they were following. And what they would often do is it was usually men who were doing that. And so they would European women that they would get them to convert to Judaism and then marry them. How formal these conversions were. I'm just throwing it out there. But they're still genetically linked back to what's fascinating is the studies they've done is like all Jews are related to one another, even if it goes back a ways, which is interesting. And they've done that through this thing called the Priestley chromosome. Is there was a scientist who was sitting in synagogue one holiday. There's a great, I'll have to pull up it's been in many articles, but there was a good one I read a long time ago that I can still get access to of this Jewish guy is a scientist and was wondering when it comes, we don't do it because we don't have any Kohanim in our congregation, but normally on holidays, there's a time in traditional services when all the priests come up and they're the ones who recite the Aaronic benediction. And when a Kohen does it, you don't say, can you hear this song? You say, no. But you actually say, instead of Ken Yehi Ratzon, you say Amen. If it's a Kohen who does it. But what's cool is the Dokanen, and Rabbi Tony can tell you, I don't know, it always gives me the chills whenever like the actual Kohanim do it. But anyway, he was watching this, and he was wondering, I wonder if there's, because he's like a good, modern Jewish skeptic. Not a skeptic, but he was like just curious. I wonder if there's anything that actually links this truth that the Kohanim are descendants of Aaron and that they're related to other Kohanim. So he did cheek swabs on Kohanim in Los Angeles, New York, I think London, or a couple places in Europe. And then he went to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And if people claimed to be a Kohen, then he would, give them a cheek swab. And he found out that they're all linked back. Not only are they all connected, but they all link back to a common ancestor. Now, you can't genetically prove it was Aaron, but what it does say is all these people who claim to have a common ancestor, no matter where they're spread out in the world, they do. And obviously we would say like, it makes sense that that common ancestor is Aaron, but they can at least say genetically is that, yes, they all share a common ancestor, which is pretty cool. And so anyway, all right. So Avinu, thank you for this opportunity to sharpen iron together. And I pray that as we progress through this class, that it would be not only informative, but it would be encouraging on different levels for each and every one of us. And so we lift this time to you and we thank you and we pray blessings on the week ahead in the name of Yeshua. Amen. All right. So thank you, everyone. Can you hear Ratzon? Can you hear this song? All right. Have a good week. Shabbat Shalom.